Thank you very much. The next speaker is Michael Pugadev, representative of Russian Indigenous Caucus. Could you please take the floor?
Спасибо.
Thank you, Madam Chairman. Distinguished participants at the 8th session of the Permanent Forum. I'm the chairman of the board of Indigenous peoples, bringing together more than 20 Indigenous peoples involved in animal husbandry on the territories of nine countries such as Russia, Finland, Sweden, Canada, the United States, Denmark, China, and Mongolia. The association was set up in 2007. However, the discussions on the Arctic today have prompted us to make a collective statement on behalf of a number of organizations of indigenous peoples in the Russian Federation with respect to the situation of the Arctic region in Russia. Russia is the largest Arctic state in terms of territorial surface area and is playing a growing role in the world, including in the light of global warming. The peoples of the Arctic are now facing many challenges stemming from climate change, and the loss of their pasture land and their hunting lands, all as a result of industrial development. And global warming in the Arctic is making the Arctic increasingly accessible to industry. Hence, there's an increasing problem related to the relations between indigenous peoples and the industrial companies. I'd like to highlight the important role of the Arctic Council and international cooperation in establishing a dialogue between the indigenous peoples of the Arctic and the Arctic states. Today, in the context of this cooperation, there are a multitude of projects being implemented. I'd especially like to refer to our project on the traditional knowledge of our peoples in adapting to climate change and the reduction in our pasture land. The Committee of the Council of the Federation made a statement today. We saw a constructive approach to resolving the problems of indigenous peoples, and a readiness to take on board our initiatives and to involve themselves in international cooperation. Of course, Russia has good, fruitful experience of cooperation with the indigenous peoples. If we're to talk about positive experience in relations with extracting industries as well, then that is another positive aspect. However, we also need to say that during the most recent Congress of Indigenous Peoples of Russia, which took place a month ago in Moscow, all the indigenous peoples of Russia were concerned by the situation which has developed in Kamchatka and a number of other regions of the Russian Federation in terms of the apportionment of land and pasture land. According to the law, these land plots will be apportioned through auctions. This violates the right of the indigenous peoples to have priority access to natural resources, because the indigenous peoples very often are not in a position to compete with major industrial companies and private business. And the result is that the indigenous peoples are left without any means of existence and are compelled to turn themselves into poachers on their own land. And then there are a number of regulatory acts which govern the distribution of these lands. For example, contracts to use such territories can only involve physical individuals, which complicates our position and makes it unrealistic for us to exercise our rights to those lands. We want legal entities, including organizations of indigenous peoples, also to have the right to be able to conclude those contracts. And then I'd also like to draw attention to the question of pasture land. The pasture land for reindeer was initially provided to us free of charge, but because of a recent regulation, on the land code of the Russian Federation and how it's applied to reindeer pasture land, the communities of the indigenous peoples are compelled to turn this right into a right of leasing or right of ownership. This is unrealistic. The pasture land for one reindeer is some 300 hectares of land, and even if we were to pay even the minimal tax rates for this, then we'd have to pay sums of hundreds of thousands of rubles a year. So our interruption from the chair. So our recommendation is that we need to enshrine in law the priority rights of indigenous peoples to use territories free of charge, and for them to be able to pursue their traditional lifestyles and ways of life there. There's a need for financing projects and programs, including at the international level, to create and develop institutions of indigenous peoples in order to build their competence and capacity for defending their rights in situ. We also need to ensure that there is a prompt professional resolution of socio-economic development issues of the indigenous peoples at the federal level, and there needs to be constant monitoring of the implementation by state authorities and the private sector of Russian legislation and the international obligations of Russia with respect to the rights of indigenous minorities. Thank you, Madam, for giving me this opportunity to speak.